We are here on a topic that refers to decommodification of higher education in our current epoch towards fees quality education for the poor. So towards free quality education for the poor. I think it's a very important topic because what we need to be asking ourselves is, should we really be seeing education as a commodity that can only be accessed by those who have the means and becomes inaccessible to those who do not? And the real issue is, should really be the issue be a struggle for each individual student, or should this be really an issue that is of concern to entire society in general, so that it doesn't really become an issue that can, on the basis of various personal circumstances, be a disadvantage to each student. Before I go into that issue, I think it's important just to go past the very recent matter that I think is hoarding headlines of late, and that is the issue of Zimbabwe. It's important also because when we're students as young as you, we used to receive a lot of inspiration from the struggle of the people of Zimbabwe. And so for us, as underground groups, we used to go out to look for radio freedom, to be in touch with what's coming from the African National Congress, but also we were always following on what was going on in Zimbabwe. So when we were young, we were this slogan of Pambirine Chimurenga, Pambirine Hondo, was part of our rallying call as young student leaders. You will know that in the 70s, some of the young leaders were actually arrested and taken to Robben Island for a pro-Frelimo rally, wherein they went to celebrate the rally, the success of Frelimo. And of course, naive as we were, at some point we actually felt that Frelimo was going to not stop in Maputo, but they were going to start crossing into South Africa. And that really was part of a lot of excitement that stimulated a lot of young people to decide we're going to go and join them. We'll meet them on the way as they were coming over. We'll be joining them as we come back together. And so the fact that we had the resignation of President Robert Mugabe, I think this is something that we must learn quite a lot about as South Africans. In the first instance, I think we have already an advantage that in both our party and countries, well, in our country's constitution, you've got a limited term for any leader of government, and on the other hand, you've also got a practice in the organization that we frown upon a third term for any leader, which means that it's very, very important for the preservation of our revolution, for us to continually regenerate our leadership and bring in new and fresh blood to lead us and take us forward. And I think this, what has happened in Zimbabwe, is something that we hope should not happen again in any of the parts of our country, but of our continent, but certainly not in our country. One thing that this would have also indicated that Zimbabwe, probably fortunately to themselves, is going to lead to a new era where possibly a whole new climate for political engagements will arise, and also a climate for economic regeneration of the economy, which is important for both our countries and also more important for the people of Zimbabwe. But I think we must also know that it offers us an opportunity for South Africa to build together the economy of SADC, because we must never think that progress means growth and development in South Africa. It means growth and development in the entire continent, particularly economically, where we've got multiple centers of growth and wealth generation, job creation, so that the whole of Africa is available to all African people to be able to move all over. Otherwise, you'll tend to get gravitation towards where there is a need for economic development. And this is why you will not stop people coming into South Africa. Of course, the other issue which for me was very important was how you have so many people involved in a protest. You got a very emotive issue and the change of a president, the army involved, not a single bullet fired, not a single window broken, no blood, no death. And I think South Africans must learn, because part of the values of our democracy is not only to be able to defend our democracy, but it's to also establish a peaceful order as well as a harmonious relationship amongst ourselves. What you saw in Zimbabwe reminded us of what happened in the Philippines, where you had Marcos ultimately stopped by his own people from continuing as a dictator, and in the process, he deployed the army, and people were very dramatic. They actually called the father of the chief of the defense force and told him to talk to his son that he cannot turn his guns against his own people, and the commander stopped the army from firing. And at the end of it, it was Ronald Reagan who had to call and say, cut it now, when Marcos had to leave. So this is history repeating itself, but also it's a lesson for all of us that we must not take our democracy, our revolution for granted. Things can go wrong, and it's up to us to make sure that these issues are corrected. But also, I think that in hosting this particular session, you do remind me as young communists of Frantz Fanon, who said that each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it or betray it, or forever live out in relative obscurity. As young people, you have to ask yourself the question, what is our mission as the young people? And I have a quote from our strategy and tactics from the Morogoro Conference in 1969, where it talks about, and I want to quote, "In our country, more than in any other part of the oppressed world, it is inconceivable for liberation to have meaning without a return of the wealth of the land to the people as a whole. It is therefore a fundamental feature of our strategy that victory must embrace more than formal political democracy. To allow the existing economic forces to retain their interests intact is to feed the root of racial supremacy and does not represent even the shadow of liberation. Our drive towards national emancipation is therefore in a very real way bound up with economic emancipation." I think this is where we must underline that when we talk about education, we're talking about education to take forward our national democratic revolution, to take us to a point of economic emancipation. It's a mission that this current generation of our young people must always keep in mind. And for us, we need to be then saying, we must look right across the various spheres of our society to say at which point do you wish to contribute in taking forward this revolution. So when you talk about economic emancipation, it has to start with the center of knowledge production. It has to start with availability of knowledge, knowledge acquisition, knowledge distribution, knowledge creation. It has to start there, and you are the ones who must actually lead that front of our struggle. We have data that was published in 2015 in Financial Statistics of Higher Education Institutions report, and it was saying just over a third of total 2015 higher education institutions income was obtained from tuition fees. The problem with the tuition fees is that it's linked to the processes of how universities decide on fee increases and so on. Now that's an area that remains always a little opaque because we don't know what goes into all of that. And so this is one of the issues. Of course, 40%, 42% was in the form of grants, and the remaining 23% was generated through other receipts, such as donations, return on investment, and so on. And this all on that year amounted to 54 billion as such, with the bulk of the expenditure going to 58% going to salaries. Now, this issue is important because the issue of access to education is something that's actually at the center of our politics, particularly the youth and student politics at the moment. In terms of our Freedom Charter, it said that the doors of learning shall be open to all. Doesn't say it will be open to those who can fund or can pay. Just says it should be open to all. And here, I think on the past 23 years, there's been a lot of progress that has been made in ensuring accessibility of education. At the moment, I think for basic education, you've got more than 95% of access. The real issue that investment have been put in there with no-fee schools, with nutrition program, etc. The issue really becomes quality here. How do we make sure that access is matched up with quality? Now, one of the things as we talk about Zimbabwe is that it had still, fortunately, a much higher level of education, and this everybody recognizes. And the difference between us is that Zimbabwe was not really faced with the legacy of apartheid education. They actually remained with the education that originally existed before apartheid was introduced, and this is a legacy of apartheid, this inequality of education and poor quality that we have to live with and try and overcome right across the whole of South Africa. So it starts there as well. But at the same time, I think there's also something to be said about even the system of our education, the need for us to balance that basic education with early introduction of technical subjects, with uniform mathematics teaching. Not this question where mathematics is almost brought in as a boogeyman, a hoho that kids must run away from, and then they get given maths lit, and then of course their future is already stunted even before they start. But we also need to be focusing on the aspect of multi-exit skill, multi-stream and exit with skills, where anyone who gets out of any of school at any level must be able to have some skills that they can utilize when they get out of school. It's not only just about looking at the national, at the level of tertiary institution, because the real issue is what happens to those who are school dropouts. When they drop out at that point, there must be something that they must be able to utilize to live from that point. And what is also missing is what we call a program of articulation of our educational system. So you can drop out at a certain level, and then through private studies, upgrading yourself, you can still get back slowly to the same mainstream of academic achievement at a later life. Now, this many countries are doing, and this is something that we should also be talking about at this level. Of course, we know insofar as tertiary education, again, lots has been done in this case. ANC-led government has improved access, and we always have the figures that in 1994, 150,000 black students were at the university, as opposed to over 750,000 today. And that number is a reflection of an effort to open up education to all our students. But we must also at the same time acknowledge the struggle for the students struggle, the hashtag fees must fall, because this did expose quite drastically the weaknesses of our system, particularly the NSFAS. Its inadequacies, its irregularities, and I was shocked the last time I was in the Eastern Cape at WOOS. I was given a report about something that was subsequently publicized in the news, where one student received 14 million rand in their account, and they were quite shocked, and then they said, "What is this?" Somebody says, "Just keep quiet, use a little bit, leave it until the end of the year, we'll come back, we'll transfer it to another account." So, had there not been the issue of the NSFAS, you would probably have missed out on the inadequacies, which are really, in a way, systemic, because the government would put an allocation based on what the budget allocates at the beginning of the year. But by the time the students register and expect to be supported on NSFAS, there's a mismatch. So you suddenly end up with a lower allocation of fees per student based on the fact that the numbers have increased, but the government envelopes did not take that into account. And this has been one of the reasons which basically saw the gaps appearing in the process. So I think that it was important, but we need to say in the context of all of that, that the African National Congress remains committed to the provision of free education at all levels, including tertiary institutions, in particular for those who are poor and the working class students. Now, I want to say to you, I got interested in some graph and stats that came when I was the chairperson of the ANC's Health and Education Subcommittee. I can just make you imagine a graph that really goes flat for a while and that just starts rising sharply upwards on the right axis. And if you imagine that, what actually that represented was a very sad situation. That if you looked at it, if you plotted on the one side increasing income, on the one side those people who have got a level of education less than matric have got a very low flat income, and it starts rising from matric upwards, goes up, and then of course with degrees and other qualifications goes up. You can translate exactly the same graph and put it on the outcomes of the students. Those students who are born of parents who have got that income, they've got exactly the same chance of passing matric as opposed to those who've got parents who have got a higher income. So the level of matric pass for those students whose parents are earning a lower amount than those who have less than matric, those who are poor, is actually 30% pass. When it gets to those parents who have got a higher income because they've got matric and their higher qualifications, their chances of passing is 84%. So for most of the time, lack of access to education because of fees and affordability means that we are actually condemning the majority of all our people to a 30% passing to matric and therefore struggling to participate at the tertiary institutions level. This graph basically is what we would term a representation of the continuation of intergenerational poverty. If your parents were uneducated and were poor and had low income, the chances are you will have more than 70% of you will not pass matric, and therefore you'll be, staying at the same level of income. But the only way of transforming that is to bring in quality education. Then people can begin to escape, intergenerational poverty. So the issue of education is right about dealing with intergenerational poverty. When we say much of our challenge has got to do with the inequality, unemployment, and poverty, education is one of the surest way of being able to deal with it. Interestingly, for some countries, in Cuba, they actually gave us a very interesting approach. The major part of the budget goes to education and health. And those two are actually being supervised at the level of the vice president, not just the minister. And the reason they say that if you have a healthy society that is educated, you've basically got, the highest potential of socioeconomic development for that country, not just for the individual, for that country. Now, I think there's merit in that, because at the end of the day, when we look at education, we need to look at it not so much as doing a favor to the students or for the young person to be able to get a better job. It must be seen as a strategic investment of the country in the development of our human capital for the overall socio-economic development of the entire country, and of course for furthering our national democratic revolution. We have seen lately the release of the HEHA Commission. Well, I'm told it's pronounced hair, so I'll try and be correct and not get my vernacular to dominate this very complex name. So, HEHA Commission. Look, we all had high expectations of this commission, but I must say that reading it, I think, even though I've not read the whole thing, but looking at the recommendation, it does appear to be grossly inadequate. In this case, there are a few aspects that we can say we would welcome. The access to, free access to TVET education, I think is a step in the right direction, and the issue of scrapping the registration fee at universities. The real challenge is that aspect of income contingency loans. Now, I think that the major challenge for all of us on that one is how that continues to create a disproportionate burden to poor students, where in principle they will struggle long after their peers might have become self-sufficient or have become prosperous. So we have a continuation of inequality, even though we thought that the process of going through the university with this payment system would have assisted. Now, this issue is exactly what the concern has been amongst the students, particularly with an ailing economy like this one and the black tax that we talk about, the fact that many students don't only have to deal with a loan, but they've also got to deal with extended families, but also trying to getting into a struggle for trying to create a self-sustainable livelihood themselves, living in a kind of a complex economy like ours. I think this does pose a huge challenge. So I think this one, something still needs to be done here, because I don't think as it stands, it offers the answer to what the students have raised. We have, as the ANC, the commitment to continue seeking solutions to address this matter of ensuring free education, and particularly for the protection of the children from poor families and working class families. But I think that when we were engaged, we were discussing the question of, is it possible for government to look into its own processes, its own systems, then reprioritize, so that they can then raise the resources that are would be necessary to cover this particular issue. So I think that's a discussion that we should be having, we're continuing to have amongst ourselves. So your point about dealing with the issue of viewing education as a commodity that really can be available only to those who can afford actually becomes relevant. And I think it's a debate that is important for youth leaders to raise, because from now on going into the future, the real politics of the country should be about what do we do with youth education? What do we do with the preparation of youth to be able to enter the job market, to be able to enter the space of being leaders in business, in government, all over. And this has to do with adequate preparation, and that adequate preparation has to be an education that is unhindered by your social circumstances of poverty and the circumstances of a very difficult formula within which the society is investing in your capacity to be trained. It has to be about education being a basic necessity and an investment in building the human capital that will help to build a prosperous nation. So when we say we want to build a South Africa that is united, non-racial, non-sexist, free, democratic, and prosperous, now that's exactly why this education is supposed to be helping us. And all of us must be, each and every one of us, preparing ourselves, how are we going to contribute in the creation of a prosperous nation. So I still want to reiterate that education has to be seen as a strategic investment that will determine growth, economic growth, or growth of our economy, and the stature of our country, and the success of a nation. This is what education must be seen. It must not be seen by you are lucky you went to school. You know, I always remember this. My son is much older now. When he was 6 years, he asked me an interesting question and said, Baba, umkhulu wafunda wagcina ku-standard 1. Kithi hayi mfana wami akazange afunde, akazange esikoleni. Wathi how? Akayanga ngane esikoleni ngoba la ku-village iy'kole eziningi kangaka. Ngithi kuye cha. lezi ikole zakhiwe nawe sewuzelwe njengoba una 6 years nje sizakhe in the past 3-4 years. He couldn't understand what I'm saying. Young as he was, already to him, he understood that we should have been able to get to that level of education. Now, it's a kind of disadvantage that is incomprehensible to everyone, how the country could allow some of its best brains to lapse as a result of the socio-economic disadvantages that the parents would have come from. So that for me becomes an issue that is at the core of the dialogue that the student leaders, youth leaders must have, but also all the leaders talking about the future of the country. Because when we talk about national democratic society that we want to create, it's a society where people will be living the kind of life where they've got access to basic services, but are also able to live a sustainable life. That is completely, makes it completely indistinguishable as to who would have been affected by apartheid and who was not. Now that kind of a future would obviously need a leveling of the playing fields. It also needs some investment into a program that will ensure equalization of all the people, and therefore education plays that particular role. But I want to move a little bit beyond that, because this education, we have to talk about curriculum changes. What would we consider to be education for economic emancipation? What would we consider for education for transformation, radical economic transformation? Do you really need the same type of education as we had before apartheid, was defeated? And if not, what changes have taken place between '94 and today in our curricula to be able to say that this education now prepares us for advancement of our NDR? Can we say we can find something in our education in that kind of regard? I think this is a challenge that you, as the budding academics and intellectuals, must exercise your minds upon. In particular, I think there's an imbalance between, for example, humanities and science. The whole idea of going out there and saying that your focus is maths and science, engineering, and very technical, or finance, accounting, and so on, technical, and you've got no sense of humanities. You do not have a sense of the kind of society that you are being trained to come and resolve its problem. It's an issue that you need to talk about, because you want people who are going to be scientists or accountants who must also understand that they are coming back to create solutions to solve the problem of a third world country like South Africa, where there's huge amount of poverty, where there's huge amount of inequality. Because if you don't do that, you do not have people who have got a mindset. You've got people who have got a mindset of wishing to go and work for the topmost companies in Sandton and not wanting to create solutions for Alexandria, 5 kilometers across. That issue of social and political consciousness amongst our youth, our students, and our academics is a major source of challenges to our revolution. It is something that we must think about. How do we keep that balance so that there is adequate political consciousness of who we are, as opposed to those who might have inherited the advantages and the privileges of their parents? That issue for me is the most important issue. So when you go out there and you talk about young students, one of the students went into a chartered accountant firm coming from Wits. So the owner of the company was very excited, and he says, he calls a meeting, and he says, well, what made you choose to come to Mkhize and Associates? Now, this was the name of the company, whatever it was. The student looked back and said, well, I wanted to go to KPMG, there was no space. I wanted to go to PwC, there was no space. I wanted to go to Ernst & Young, there was no space. And I went to one other, there was no space, so the only place I could go to was you. Of course, the man was disappointed, because when he understood the challenges that they faced as black professionals, where he grew up from a point where they started as accountants, doing bookkeeping for Kentucky shop at the corner of the street and the garage nearby, and those shopkeepers were running corner shops. That's all they could do. They had no access to the mainstream of the economy. And when they started to get in there, they found that there were unwritten rules that were barriers of entry that threw them out completely and kept them completely isolated, even though a lot of them were starting to do work with government. Now, the disproportionate access of these big firms to contracts by government were such that it was actually relegating to our own professionals again to the periphery. But here, the mindset of our young students is that you are so bad, we need to go for those who are already within the advantage, because our system does not talk to the need for us to develop those who have been disadvantaged. And this issue is from your peers. A lot of students will go out and go and target that because they feel that whatever we're trying to develop is actually, a third class, and therefore it's not worth worrying about. Only later, when they emerge and start growing in their careers, they begin to understand these contradictions that still persist, even though you thought that you have now arrived simply because you have now got the right academic qualification that everyone else has here. And you suddenly realize that you will be relegated to labor relations matters if you are a lawyer, but those who go to deal with corporate and commercial law issues in the same firm are the white students. And suddenly you realize that the decision-making process internal to this whole issue is based on those who have got connections to be able to bring more business because of their ancestral origin, as opposed to you who has to walk around and try and ask for BEE partners to give you business to come and contribute to your company. All of a sudden, you can see where the inequality comes from. It's too late. So the point which we need to raise here is about, for students as they grow, to have the social and political consciousness of understanding the environment within which their qualifications, however distinguished they might be, that they will actually have that problem. It always reminds me of the early years, the Law Society, those days in the 1906, 1909, could just decide that, listen, there are not enough black people to give a business to a black lawyer, so we will not admit the lawyer to be a lawyer, despite the qualification. That's what happened to Mangena. And there had to be a big fight going to court to fight that issue. But today, the same thing is happening under very different guise. And unless we're conscious of that, you'll get out there and collaborate with the system instead of breaking down and transforming it. And this is part of why you have to get involved in this kind of debate. So, for example, what one is saying is that we need to be looking at not just leaving it there, it's an autonomous thing between government, political leadership, and academic leaders. We need to be saying, where should we be focusing on particular pipelines for training people in a particular area, so that it is a predetermined strategy to achieve a developmental agenda. So if I give you an example, when you looked at the Jack Hammer report that looked at top CEOs in the country, it analyzed, firstly, that the numbers of black CEOs was not growing, around 14%, black CEOs. Now, many of you would want to be that type of thing, called a black CEO. That number is not increasing. And the reason why it's not increasing is because nobody's feeding the pipeline. So you don't have a special program to develop them, you don't have mentors. But also, another issue was a problem. 65% of the CEOs come from the finance and accounting world. So all the humanities and others won't get there. So once you want to sit here and take over those top companies, which we must, you have a problem because the numbers we have don't match what is needed there. 12.5% of CEOs came from engineering and legal. The rest, no. This is the issue, that we need a predetermined strategy of where we're going to be, targeting training, so that we know we want this group to go there and take over, there and take over. That's what it means to actually lead a revolution, where we don't just allow everything to go on. Yes, they are corporate. They could be belonging to white monopoly capital. It could be belong to anybody. The point is that we have to take charge. And taking charge we must. And it's you who must be ready for that. And so when we talk to you, we're talking to you different from what Verwoerd would have said, that you are being prepared to work for the white men and white men's companies. This time we're saying we're preparing you to take charge of your country and its economy. You want to lead and lead everywhere. If you leave a gap for any part not to be led by people who understand where our revolution is coming and going, we are basically creating a delay in our advancement of this revolution. And so this is one area that's important. We deal with the issue of our curriculum. We need to bring in a very strong emphasis on research. Everything advancement is about new knowledge. Knowledge that no one else has. Is a knowledge that you need to create new solutions. Only when you got new information that people don't have, that's when you become a leader. And linked to that, there must be some degree of innovation fund. That should even start at the level of the institutions. I've got an idea, go and try it and let it fly. Because there's support for it from the state and from corporate. That's what needs to happen in terms of our curriculum. Focus on youth entrepreneurship course. Literally all of you need to be trained on youth entrepreneurship. It didn't happen automatically that black people were not into business. They were systematically isolated. Now we need to recorrect that. So that's another issue. But also ICT. Now we're living in the area of growing digitized economy and the fourth industrial revolution. When I grew up, you didn't even touch computer, we didn't even know. We only learned this stuff afterwards. Today, you cannot succeed in your first year course unless you can have access to research, internet research. It's now a disadvantage to you. So when the students said to me, they were wanting Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi for every hostel, I thought, now we're going somewhere. Because this access was, when we grew up, we could stand here and give you a table of 2 times 2, 2 times 12, and our mental arithmetic was very sharp. We couldn't understand when it was said you can walk into an exam with a calculator. Today, no access to data. You have no access to your first degree. You cannot. And so this is a changing situation. Then, of course, we need integration of state, academic institutions, and research and industries. Because in the US and UK, there are towns that are actually built from the knowledge that comes from institutions, helping industries to grow. For any industry to be competitive, they've actually got to use academics to actually research and grow. If you go to some of the Eastern countries, exactly that's what is being done. The quality of your industry depends on the quality of your academic training. I went to one university in the Czech Republic, and just dealing with clothing and textile, which was really declining here in this country. And we asked them, what is their strength? They said, you see, in this university, the Department of Clothing and Textile has got 84 PhDs in it. They research literally anything about fabric. That's the only way you can lead. That's the only way you can succeed. If we don't think that way, let's forget it, because everyone else is going to think for us, and all we'll do is to deal with cheap imports from people who have already researched it, what an easy market for them. We need to be changing that. Our revolution means we need to change and pick up particular niche areas where we're going to make our country to be in the forefront. So the whole question of knowledge economy becomes a very important issue. But the issue of knowledge production, I don't know how many of you have thought about this. That the reason why, if you go to most of the institutions, it's been, particularly in the last protest, the whole talk about black consciousness, and Biko, who made a very remarkable contribution. And black consciousness was also a very important phase in the development of consciousness amongst us. But how much was spoken about the revolution, South African, the theory of South African revolution? The role of Tambo, the role of Mandela, other than finding people who are already saying, well, Mandela sold out and not even understand what is that Mandela's generation, what mission they had to fulfill. This is a challenge to you now. To say, for us, we need to say, amongst yourself, we must start increasing the numbers of academics who come from revolutionary movements like us. That's what you must go and ensure you take charge of those institutions. So that the prevailing discourse in all academic institutions must be premised on the theory of our own revolution and our view or vision of where South Africa should be going. That's a very serious issue, because if we fail in that level, you are actually creating an opportunity for a new revolution that could even reverse whatever we would have achieved at this point, instead of advancing what we've already achieved so far. This takes us to a point where we're saying, if you look today, the numbers of black academics is very low. I think we deal here with something like 27% of academics. I think we've got about 27% of professors are black. That number means that we must target here, people must go into this thing. But you must look back. Most of the leaders of the other nationalist movement, even if you look at the Afrikaners, their leaders were some of the topmost academics. This song that we talk about which is part of our national anthem, Die Stem van Zuid-Afrika. That fellow was one of the topmost academics. Their main issue was Afrikaner nationalism. Here, we need us, those of us who are in the, who are part of the revolutionary movement, to be the topmost amongst the academics. That's where we need to be able to say we need, but it needs, you must have support, you must have determination, but you must have mentorship, and government must put money, corporate must put money. On these PhD programs now, that's very, very important. So I thought I must just leave you here and say that what I think is important is to ensure that amongst the leading academics must also be the leading revolutionaries. And that's what I want to leave you with. But I want to say this, it's important as well, because you need all of that leadership for us to begin to insist, even amongst our own movement, about the need for real training and academic qualifications for leaders of our movement at different levels. If we want to ensure that we deal with the problems of corruption, we deal with the problems of rent seeking, we deal with the problems of gatekeepers, dealing with the violence, political violence, and all of this, you need to actually up the bar. Make sure now that our leadership actually has got a lot of, training, so that the level at which we compete must be a level where you have to exert yourself with the new ideas and new solutions that you're going to bring. We're going to an ANC conference now. This conference now is marked by, problems of divisions, infighting, what you call factionalism, and we're calling for unity, because we believe that all of these things that we're talking about, and even the solution of our problem, radical economic transformation, fighting corruption, you can only do so if you've got a united organization that is strong on discipline, that is strong on ethical leadership, that is strong on people being able to lead on the basis of capacity and experience, that can actually generate and inspire hope amongst all our people. This is where we need to be working together, because that way we will actually be able to take South Africa into the future. We've got a long way to go with our revolution, and we believe that it's important that we must grow our own timber. Our youth must already aspire for that level of leadership, but you must play a role now in the fighting of dismantling of slate politics, and making sure that when we get onto the conference, we can have a uniting conference. We went then, had a meeting with the president, and the issue was all of these people who are supposed to be candidates, we must not send a message that creates an impression that we want to go there and fight, we want to go there. But the point is that we need to prevail on all these negative tendencies that we see, the manipulation of the branches, the black bags, and all of that. We must stand together to fight all of that and unite around an ethical leadership in this movement. This is all part and parcel of the package of what it will mean to ensure that we invest in education for all our people. Then it's easier to deal with issues and principles rather than people being driven on the basis of patronage because they've got no choice, because of poverty, because people sometimes might have a limitation in being able to choose the right solutions, and in some instances, people only depend on that kind of income. That we must understand that investing in education is solving all of those problems that we're facing. I wish you everything all the best, and thank you very much.